My name is Daniel Hart, a 40-year-old high school literature teacher with a deep love for the classics and the kind of routine life most people dream of. My wife Emily and I lived in a quiet town on the outskirts of Portland, where our days were filled with simple pleasures, lazy Sunday mornings, the smell of her coffee brewing in the kitchen, and evening conversations about everything and nothing. We had been married for 9 years, and though the initial spark had dimmed into a comfortable rhythm, I believed we were happy. Emily, with her auburn hair and soft laugh, was my anchor. She worked as an events planner, her days spent coordinating weddings and corporate galas. I always admired how she could make even chaos seem elegant. Life was steady, even idyllic, until shattered reflections came into our home. It started innocuously enough. Emily attended a book signing one Saturday afternoon, something I had encouraged. She had always enjoyed reading, though her tastes leaned toward light romances and thrillers. When she returned that evening, there was a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. "You wouldn't believe how captivating Julian Grant is," she said, holding up a signed hardcover with the kind of excitement reserved for teenagers meeting their idols. The title gleamed in bold letters, Shattered Reflections. "Julian Grant," I repeated, frowning slightly. I'd heard the name, a rising star in the literary world known for his intricate, emotionally charged novels. "I didn't know you were a fan." "I wasn't," she admitted, her cheeks flushed. "But after today, I'm hooked. He has this way of making you see the world differently. You should have come with me, Daniel. You'd have loved his talk about storytelling." I smiled, brushing off her enthusiasm. "Maybe next time." She handed me the book, beaming. "Look, he signed it." I opened to the title page. There it was, written in elegant, looping script. "To Emily for seeing beauty in fragments." It struck me as overly personal for a book signing, but I dismissed the thought. Writers often romanticize their fans. Besides, Emily had a common enough name. I congratulated her on meeting him and thought little more of it. Over the next few days, however, her excitement didn't wane. She devoured the book in a matter of days, marking passages with sticky notes and quoting lines during dinner. "There's this one part," she said one evening, flipping through the pages. "It's about how relationships can be both fragile and resilient, like stained glass. Isn't that beautiful?" "Sure," I replied, though I felt more amused than interested. Emily's passion was endearing, if a little unusual. She had never shown such zeal for an author before. The following weekend, she announced she was attending another of Julian Grant's events, a panel discussion in the city. "It's not far," she assured me, her tone almost pleading. "He'll be talking about his new book, and I've already signed up for the workshop afterward." I nodded, encouraging her to go. "Enjoy yourself," I said, though a pang of jealousy flickered in my chest. Emily returned late that night, glowing. "It was incredible," she gushed, tossing her coat onto a chair. "Julian remembered me, Daniel. He asked about my thoughts on Shattered Reflections." Her words made my stomach churn, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way she said his name, Julian, as if it carried more weight than it should. I shook off the feeling, telling myself I was overthinking. But as the weeks passed, Emily's fascination grew. She attended more of his events, stayed out late, and began volunteering for literary organizations. Her phone was suddenly glued to her hand, her attention divided during our conversations. The changes were subtle but unsettling. One rainy afternoon, I finally picked up Shattered Reflections. If this book had such a profound impact on my wife, perhaps it would help me understand what she was feeling. The story was gripping, I admitted, though something about it unsettled me. The protagonist, Olivia, was described with vivid intimacy, her auburn hair, her love of pressed flowers, her habit of humming softly while cooking. My chest tightened. These details mirrored Emily almost perfectly. It could have been a coincidence, I told myself. After all, people often saw themselves in books. Then I read this passage. She spoke of her sanctuary, a trail carved through a cedar grove where sunlight fractured like glass and silence offered its rare comfort. My breath caught. That was Emily's favorite spot, a secluded hiking trail we discovered during our honeymoon, a place only we shared. I closed the book, heart pounding. My wife's admiration for Julian Grant suddenly seemed far more complicated than I'd imagined. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me since reading Shattered Reflections. Julian Grant's novel was too precise, too intimate. Emily's admiration for him, once charming, now felt like a thread unraveling the fabric of our life. In the days that followed, I began noticing more changes in her. Emily, who once left her phone on the counter without a second thought, now kept it close. She smiled at messages that lit up her screen and brushed off my curiosity with vague explanations. "It's just the group chat from the book club," she'd say, her tone light but her eyes darting away. One evening while she was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I hesitated, torn between respecting her privacy and the gnawing suspicion that something was amiss. The screen glowed with a notification. "Julian, can't wait to see you tomorrow. I've been working on something inspired by our last talk." My stomach dropped. I stared at the message, my mind racing. Inspired by our last talk? The implications were glaring. Julian Grant wasn't just an author my wife admired. He was someone she was meeting privately, someone who found inspiration in her. When Emily emerged from the bathroom, I tried to keep my voice steady. "Are you seeing Julian again soon?" Her head snapped toward me, droplets of water still clinging to her hair. "What do you mean?" "You mentioned he remembered you at the last event," I said, treading carefully. "Are you planning to go to another one of his workshops?" She hesitated, the slightest pause before answering. "There's a literary festival in the city this weekend. I thought I might check it out. He's hosting a panel." My chest tightened. "And that's all it is?" Her expression shifted, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Why are you asking me this, Daniel? You've always encouraged me to pursue my interests." "I have," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I'm just noticing how much time you're spending on this." Emily sighed, shaking her head. "You're overthinking things. Julian's an incredible writer, that's all. It's inspiring to be around someone so passionate about their craft." Her words stung more than they should have. Was I not passionate? Wasn't teaching literature my craft? I swallowed my frustration and nodded, letting the conversation drop, for now. The next morning, as Emily prepared to leave for the festival, I decided I couldn't sit idly by. I told her I had errands to run, kissed her goodbye, and waited until she drove off. Then I followed her. The festival was held in a historic theater downtown. I parked across the street and watched as Emily stepped out of her car, her figure illuminated by the marquee lights. She wasn't alone for long. Julian Grant emerged from the theater's side entrance, his tall frame and disheveled charm unmistakable. Emily's face lit up when she saw him. They exchanged a brief hug, and she handed him a bag, one of the carefully curated gift baskets she often prepared for her clients. He smiled, the kind of smile that lingered, and they disappeared inside together. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I debated what to do. I couldn't confront her here, not without proof. Instead, I bought a ticket to the festival, slipping into the back row of Julian's panel. The room was packed, buzzing with excitement as he spoke about his creative process. His charm was undeniable, his voice smooth and magnetic. I watched Emily from a distance, seated in the front row, her eyes fixed on him with rapt attention. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Stories come from everywhere," Julian explained, his gaze sweeping the audience. "But the best ones are born from personal connections. When you find someone who inspires you, who challenges you, their essence seeps into the pages." He paused, his eyes flicking toward Emily for the briefest moment. "Sometimes," he continued, "those stories aren't just fiction. They're reflections of something real, something you've experienced. Art can blur the lines between imagination and memory." The crowd erupted in applause, but I couldn't move. His words felt like a confession disguised as insight, a thinly veiled acknowledgement of what I had suspected all along. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, I returned to Shattered Reflections. I combed through its pages, searching for more clues, more pieces of my life woven into the narrative. I found them. The protagonist's wife, Olivia, wasn't just similar to Emily. She was Emily. Her quirks, her favorite places, even the way she tied her hair back when concentrating, it was all there. The protagonist, however, was described as everything I wasn't: bold, creative, untethered by routine. And then there was the affair. In the novel, Olivia meets an enigmatic writer who sees her in a way her husband never could, who brings out a side of her she had long buried. It wasn't just fiction. It was their story. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The affair wasn't just a possibility. It was playing out in plain sight, immortalized in a best-selling novel. I stared at the words on the page, my hands trembling. Julian Grant had taken the intimacy of my marriage, twisted it into a narrative, and shared it with the world. Worse, Emily had let him. That night, I barely slept. The weight of my discovery pressed down on me like a lead blanket. I turned over every moment from the past few months, replaying the subtle shifts in Emily's behavior, the growing distance between us. I wanted to confront her immediately, but my emotions were a storm of rage, betrayal, and heartbreak. I needed clarity, a plan, and most of all, undeniable proof. The following day, I decided to dive deeper into Julian's work. If Shattered Reflections held so many parallels to my life, maybe his other novels would too. I purchased his previous books and spent the weekend poring over them, scouring for patterns, clues, anything that connected him to Emily. To my dismay, they all shared a common thread, a recurring female character who bore striking similarities to her. In Fragments of Desire, the woman was a free spirit who rekindled her passion through a forbidden romance. In Eclipsed Light, she was a married woman caught between duty and desire, finding solace in the arms of a brooding artist. The details varied, but the essence was unmistakable. Julian wasn't just writing fiction, he was chronicling his conquests, each novel a thinly veiled autobiography. Emily wasn't the first, but she was the most recent. And if the tone of his latest book was any indication, the one he considered his muse. I began tracking her movements more closely. Emily's explanations for her absences no longer satisfied me. She claimed she was meeting friends or attending work events, but her stories were riddled with inconsistencies. I started making notes, jotting down dates, times, and details she shared. One evening, when she announced she'd be working late on a corporate event, I decided to follow her. I trailed her car through the winding streets of our town, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion. She didn't head toward any of her usual venues. Instead, she drove to a boutique hotel on the edge of the city. I parked across the street, my heart pounding as I watched her enter the building. 10 minutes later, Julian Grant walked in, dressed in a tailored coat that made him look every bit the literary darling he was. They didn't even try to be discreet. He placed a hand on her back as they approached the elevator, his touch lingering. I sat in my car, paralyzed by the confirmation of what I had already known. That night, I couldn't hold back any longer. When Emily returned home, I was waiting for her in the living room. She walked in, smiling faintly, but froze when she saw my expression. "Where were you tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice calm despite the storm inside me. She blinked, caught off guard. "I told you, I had a work event." "At a hotel?" I said, holding her gaze. "With Julian Grant?" Her face drained of color, and for a moment she didn't speak. Then she laughed nervously, shaking her head. "You're being ridiculous, Daniel. Julian is just a friend." "Stop lying," I snapped, my voice rising. "I saw you. I followed you. Do you think I'm blind? Or just stupid?" Her mouth opened and closed, the words failing her. Finally, she sat down, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered. I laughed bitterly. Didn't mean for what to happen? The affair? The betrayal? Or letting him write about it for everyone to read? Emily looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's not what you think. Julian and I, we connected, yes. But it's more than that. He sees me, Daniel. He sees the parts of me that have been invisible for years." "Invisible?" I echoed, the words stinging like a slap. "I've spent nearly a decade loving you, supporting you, building a life with you. And you call yourself invisible?" She wiped her eyes, but her voice was steady now. "You love the version of me that fits into your world. Julian loves the version of me that dreams beyond it." Her words struck a nerve I hadn't known existed. I stared at her, realizing there was no salvaging this moment, no turning back to the life we once had. After Emily went to bed, I stayed up, staring at the copy of Shattered Reflections on the coffee table. It felt like the book was mocking me. its pages a testament to my failure to see the cracks in our marriage. I flipped to the final chapter, hoping for some closure, some resolution. Instead, I found a passage that chilled me to my core. When the mirror shattered, he realized the pieces couldn't be put back together. But perhaps in the brokenness, there was a truth he hadn't seen before, a reflection of who he truly was, stripped of illusions. Julian wasn't just writing about his relationship with Emily. He was writing about me, about the man left behind in the wake of their affair. The days following Emily's confession passed in a fog. Every word she had said replayed in my mind, mingling with Julian Grant's prose until I couldn't separate fiction from reality. The life I thought we had was gone, replaced by a fractured version where love and betrayal intertwined. Emily tried to keep things normal, as if her admission hadn't shattered us. She went about her routines with forced cheer, cooking breakfast and asking about my day. But I couldn't engage. Every time I looked at her, I saw Julian's hand on her back, his words immortalizing their affair in his books. I spent my nights obsessively researching Julian Grant. His online presence was polished and curated, a perfect blend of literary acclaim and effortless charm. Articles praised his ability to capture human emotions, calling him the voice of a generation. His Instagram was filled with artfully composed photos of book signings, coffee shops, and handwritten pages scattered across mahogany desks. Buried among the carefully filtered images was one that froze me in my tracks. It was a candid shot of a woman, her face obscured as she walked through a cedar grove. The caption read, "Inspiration strikes in the quiet moments." Even without seeing her face, I knew it was Emily. The grove was unmistakable. Our grove, the sanctuary we had discovered together. My hands clenched into fists as I realized Julian had not only stolen my wife, but also claimed pieces of our life as his own. I couldn't stay passive anymore. I needed answers. But more than that, I needed justice. The following week, Emily announced she'd be heading to another literary event. She was careful not to call it a workshop or mention Julian by name, but I wasn't naive. I feigned indifference, kissing her goodbye and wishing her a good time. Once she left, I packed a bag and followed her, this time more prepared. I had bought a cheap secondhand camera, the kind with a zoom lens long enough to capture details from a distance. I also carried a small notebook, determined to document everything. The event was held at a vineyard an hour outside the city, a secluded, picturesque setting, perfect for secrets. I parked far from the main entrance, slipping through the rows of grapevines until I found a vantage point. Through the camera's lens, I saw Emily and Julian standing off to the side, away from the crowd. They were laughing, their heads close together. He handed her a book, probably another early draft, and she hugged him, lingering in his arms. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep watching. It wasn't enough to confront her with my suspicions. I needed undeniable proof. After the event, I followed them to a nearby bed and breakfast. The charm of the place was almost ironic, a storybook setting for a betrayal that felt like a nightmare. I snapped photos of them checking in, Julian's hand resting possessively on Emily's lower back. I stayed in my car, waiting for hours, my mind racing with scenarios. Should I storm in and confront them? Wait until they left and expose them with the evidence I'd gathered? The answers didn't come, only an aching emptiness where my resolve should have been. Back home, Emily returned late, her excuses rehearsed and hollow. I played along, pretending to believe her stories about networking and literary discussions. Every word she spoke felt like another twist of the knife, but I kept my anger in check. I wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. Instead, I turned my focus to Julian. If he thought he could use my wife and my life for his art, I would show him the cost of his arrogance. I began writing letters, anonymously, of course. The first was addressed to Julian's publisher, detailing his unethical behavior and his habit of turning personal relationships into material for his books. I included the photos I had taken as evidence, careful to frame the narrative in a way that made him look predatory and exploitative. The second letter was for Emily. I slipped it into her purse one morning before she left for work. In it, I laid out everything I had discovered, the mirrored details in his novels, the photos, the lies. I didn't sign my name, but I made it clear I knew everything. Her reaction was immediate. That evening, she confronted me, waving the letter in her hand. "Did you write this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. I looked at her calmly. "What does it say?" Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair. It says, it says someone knows about Julian and me, that they've been watching us." I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch. "Daniel, if you—" "Why would I write an anonymous letter to my own wife?" I interrupted, my voice cold. Her eyes widened, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. She didn't believe me, but she couldn't prove otherwise. "I think," I continued, "that you should take some time to think about what you want. And while you're at it, tell your writer friend to be more careful about who he uses for inspiration." Emily didn't sleep in our bed that night. I heard her pacing in the living room, her phone buzzing intermittently. The next morning she left early without a word, her face pale and drawn. I watched her drive away, a mix of anger and satisfaction coursing through me. She wasn't the only one who could play games. The tension in the house was suffocating. Emily and I existed as strangers under the same roof, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Her movements were careful, as though she feared triggering another confrontation. For my part, I kept my distance, masking my turmoil with icy indifference. I knew she had spoken to Julian. The change in her demeanor was unmistakable, guarded, anxious. I imagined their conversations, the panic in his voice as he realized someone was watching, that his carefully curated world might unravel. The thought gave me grim satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't finished. The next phase of my plan required precision. I needed to dismantle Julian's image, to show the world what kind of man he truly was. His reputation was his lifeline, and I intended to sever it. I began collecting more evidence, combing through his interviews, social media posts, and public appearances for inconsistencies. I reached out to former colleagues and acquaintances under the guise of being a journalist working on a profile. Some were eager to share, their admiration for Julian tempered by tales of his arrogance and manipulative tendencies. One woman, a literary agent who had worked with him early in his career, hinted at something darker. "Julian's talent is undeniable," she said, "but his relationships always come with collateral damage. He has a way of pulling people into his orbit and discarding them when they're no longer useful." Her words solidified my resolve. A week later, I sent an anonymous email to a prominent literary blog, attaching the photos of Julian and Emily at the hotel, along with excerpts from his books that mirrored their affair. I framed it as an exposé, emphasizing how he exploited personal relationships for profit. I knew the blog thrived on sensationalism, and the scandal was too juicy for them to ignore. The story went live within days, its headline bold and accusatory: "Julian Grant, the author who writes his lovers into fiction." It detailed his pattern of turning affairs into art, using Emily as the latest example. The photos I provided were blurred for anonymity, but the implications were clear. The backlash was immediate. Social media lit up with debates about the ethics of Julian's work. Fans expressed disappointment, while critics reveled in the opportunity to tear him down. His publisher issued a tepid statement defending his creative process, but distanced themselves from the personal allegations. I watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. Julian's carefully crafted persona was crumbling, and I had been the one to light the match. Emily was livid when she found out. She stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger. "Did you do this?" she demanded, thrusting her phone in my face. The screen displayed the article, the damning headline glaring at me. I met her gaze calmly. "What if I did?" Her hands trembled as she lowered the phone. "You had no right, Daniel. This isn't just about him. It's about me. You've humiliated me." "No," I said, my voice cold. "You humiliated yourself. You chose to betray me, to lie to me. I just made sure the world knew the truth." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't understand. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then how was it supposed to be, Emily?" I asked, my voice rising. "Was I supposed to turn a blind eye while you carried on with him? Was I supposed to read about your affair in his books and applaud his artistic genius?" Her tears spilled over, but I felt no sympathy. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Julian, predictably, tried to fight back. He issued a statement calling the article a gross misrepresentation of his work and personal life. He denied the affair outright, claiming his relationship with Emily was strictly professional. But the damage was done, his credibility was shattered, and even his most ardent supporters began questioning the authenticity of his stories. Bookstores quietly pulled his titles from prominent displays, and invitations to literary events were rescinded. As for Emily, her world unraveled alongside his. Friends and colleagues whispered behind her back, their judgment palpable. She withdrew, retreating into herself as the weight of the scandal bore down on her. One night, as we sat in silence at the dinner table, she finally broke. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know how it got this far." I put down my fork, looking at her tired, tear-streaked face. "You made a choice, Emily, over and over again. You chose him, and now you're living with the consequences." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know, but I need to ask, can we ever fix this?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and impossible. I wanted to believe it was possible, that we could rebuild what had been broken. But the trust we once had was gone, replaced by a chasm too wide to cross. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice hollow. "I honestly don't know." That night I slept on the couch, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past months played out in my mind. Julian had been exposed, Emily was broken, and yet I felt no triumph. Revenge had consumed me, but it hadn't brought me peace. I realized then that I couldn't stay in this limbo, clinging to a life that no longer existed. Something had to change, whether it was reconciliation or walking away for good. In the days following Emily's plea for reconciliation, our home became a vacuum of sound. Words felt meaningless, incapable of bridging the canyon that had opened between us. I took to spending long hours away, grading papers at a nearby cafe, aimlessly walking the trails we once explored together. Even the stillness of those familiar woods felt tainted, as though the air itself carried the weight of her betrayal. Emily, for her part, retreated into herself. She cooked meals neither of us ate, cleaned rooms we barely used. It was as though she believed a pristine house could somehow erase the mess of our lives. Every so often I'd catch her watching me, her eyes red-rimmed, searching for a sign of forgiveness. I gave her none. I wasn't sure what I wanted. For months I had been consumed by the need to uncover the truth, to expose the lie that had festered in our marriage. Now that the truth was laid bare, I felt untethered, drifting through a sea of emotions I couldn't name. Anger, yes, but also grief, loss, even the faint echo of love that refused to vanish despite everything. One evening, as I sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, Emily approached with hesitant steps. She held a stack of papers, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the coffee table. "What's this?" I asked, not bothering to hide the weariness in my voice. "It's everything," she said softly. "Emails, texts, the truth about Julian and me. I thought if you could see it all, maybe you'd understand." Understand. The word felt like a slap, as if understanding could undo the damage or erase the nights I spent questioning my worth. But curiosity won out. I picked up the stack, leafing through the pages. There were long email threads filled with literary discussions, passages he'd sent her from unfinished manuscripts, compliments that gradually shifted from her intellect to her beauty. And then there were the texts. His words dripped with charm, tailored to disarm and seduce. Her responses were hesitant at first, but over time, they became warmer, more open. My stomach churned as I read the evolution of their relationship, the small flirtations that grew into something larger. "I didn't want this to happen," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I swear, Daniel, I didn't go looking for it. But he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years." I looked up at her, anger bubbling to the surface. And what about me? Was I just a placeholder until someone better came along? Her eyes widened. "No, God, no. You've always been good to me, Daniel. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. We became comfortable." "Comfortable," I repeated bitterly. "So that justifies betrayal?" "No," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Nothing justifies it. I was selfish. I was weak. And I've destroyed the one thing I thought I could never lose. Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. For a moment I saw her not as my wife, but as a deeply flawed human being, riddled with regret. But even that realization couldn't soften the edges of my pain. I need time, I said finally, setting the papers down. Time to figure out what's left of us, if there's anything left at all. Emily nodded, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. Take all the time you need, she said quietly. I'll wait, no matter how long it takes. But deep down, I knew time wasn't the solution. Trust, once shattered, was nearly impossible to rebuild. And love, no matter how deeply rooted, couldn't thrive in the shadow of betrayal. Weeks turned into months, and the silence in our home evolved from oppressive to indifferent. Emily no longer tried to engage me in conversation, and I no longer pretended to find solace in her presence. We moved like strangers through the same spaces, bound by memories that felt more like burdens than bonds. The love we once shared had become a phantom, haunting every corner of our lives. During this time, I sought refuge in the one constant that hadn't betrayed me: literature. My classroom became a sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the works of others. Shakespeare's tragedies, Austen's complexities, Orwell's truths, they all took on new meaning, reflecting fragments of my own fractured life. My students noticed the change in me, though they were too polite to comment. I poured my energy into them, using their youthful curiosity as a balm for my wounds. Emily, meanwhile, began rebuilding her life in quiet, measured steps. She resigned from her events planning job, citing a need for a fresh start, and took up a position at a small nonprofit. She spent her evenings volunteering, helping organize book drives and literacy programs. I suspected this was her way of atoning, though she never said as much. Julian, on the other hand, had disappeared from the public eye. The scandal I had ignited proved too damaging for even his charm to overcome. His publisher quietly dropped him, and the literary world moved on, eager to embrace the next rising star. Occasionally, I'd come across an article speculating on his whereabouts, but the man who had once commanded the spotlight had faded into obscurity. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves painted the streets in hues of amber and gold, I found myself drawn to the cedar grove where it all began. The trail was as serene as I remembered, the sunlight filtering through the trees in fractured beams. It was a place that had once symbolized unity, but now it felt like a place to say goodbye. I sat on a fallen log, the weight of the past year pressing down on me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to cry, not out of anger or despair, but out of acceptance. I mourned the life I thought I had, the love I thought was unshakable, and in that morning I found a strange kind of freedom. When I returned home, I knew what I had to do. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands, her face etched with weariness. She looked up as I entered, her eyes searching mine for any sign of hope. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She nodded, setting her cup down. "I've been waiting for this." I sat across from her, the table a symbolic barrier between us. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about us, about everything that's happened, and I've realized something. Holding on to this marriage isn't fair to either of us. We've both changed, Emily, and we can't go back to who we were." Her lips trembled, but she didn't argue. "I understand," she said softly. "I've hurt you in ways I can never take back, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I hope you find happiness, Daniel, even if it's without me."